The plain of Pharsalus, central Greece, August 9, 48 BCE. Pompey the Great looked across the grass at an army half the size of his own and saw a battle that was already won. He had 45,000 men. His enemy had perhaps 22,000, underfed, far from home, cut off from the sea. Pompey's officers were reportedly arguing that morning about which of them would get which office back in Rome. On the other side of that field, in the front rank of the 10th Legion, at the extreme right-hand edge of his unit, stood a man named Gaius Crastinus. He had already served his full term as a first spear centurion, the senior professional officer of an entire legion. He had earned the right to be anywhere else. Instead, he was standing in the single most lethal position the Roman military system had to offer, the front right corner of the formation, the spot where the enemy's best men would arrive first, and he was there on purpose. By the end of the day, Crastinus would be dead, killed by a sword thrust through the mouth, and the numbers that survive in Caesar's own account of the battle tell a strange story. Around 200 ordinary soldiers lost. 30 centurions, officers who made up little more than one man in 80, died at many times the rate of the men they led. And this was not unusual. It was the pattern, battle after battle, for centuries. So the question is not whether Roman centurions were brave. The question is why an empire that was ruthlessly practical about everything else deliberately spent its most experienced, most expensive, hardest to replace soldiers in the one place they were most likely to die. The answer is not courage. The answer is arithmetic. A shield wall has a communication problem, a hard mathematical limit on how fast information can move through 8,000 screaming men, and the centurion standing in the front rank was Rome's solution to it. There is also a detail on his helmet, a crest turned sideways, ear to ear, that almost everyone reads as decoration, and it is nothing of the kind. We will come back to that crest because it may be the single smartest piece of the whole design. Here is what this episode will actually settle. First, the arithmetic of a shouted order. Why a command spoken aloud dies within a few dozen meters of open ground and within arm's reach of a battle line, and what that dead zone forced Rome to invent. Second, the transverse crest itself, and a pair of 20th century vision experiments that explain, in milliseconds, why a sideways bar of horsehair works and a front-to-back one does not. Third, the checkerboard, the manipular system that broke one army into 30 self-steering units, each with its own decision-maker, and where that structure actually came from. Fourth, an American fighter pilot named John Boyd, who in the 20th century rediscovered the Centurion's equation, gave it a name, the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, and changed modern warfare with it. And fifth, the day the whole system switched off, a forest in Germany where 3 entire legions discovered what happens when the mathematics stop working, because the failure proves the mechanism better than any victory does. This channel takes battles apart the way an engineer takes apart a machine, not who was brave, but what the design was actually for. Every date, number, and name in this episode comes from the surviving record or from published research, and where the record is thin, you will hear that plainly. Start with what a Roman battle line actually was, because the popular image is wrong in the one way that matters. Picture the century, the basic building block, 80 men in the classic arrangement, drawn up several ranks deep, shields overlapping, each man occupying roughly a meter of frontage. 10 such centuries paired into maniples, or later grouped into cohorts, and a full legion carried around 60 centurions, one professional decision-maker for every 80 fighting men. Now put that block into contact with an enemy. The sound environment collapses immediately. Thousands of men are shouting. Metal is striking layered wood at a rate of hundreds of impacts a minute along the line, and each of those impacts is a shield. 3 sheets of glued plank designed specifically to absorb and radiate the shock of a blow, functioning by accident as a drum. Wounded men are screaming behind you and in front of you. Horns are blowing somewhere. Acoustically, a sustained melee sits comfortably above 100 decibels, the territory of a rock concert or a chainsaw, and a human shout at full effort produces perhaps 88 decibels measured a meter from the mouth, fading by the inverse square law with every step of distance. The signal starts below the noise floor and gets worse from there. Under those conditions, the useful range of an unaided human voice, A range of a few dozen meters across a quiet parade ground contracts to almost nothing. A centurion could bellow an order and reasonably expect the 5 or 6 men immediately around him to hear it. The man 20 meters down the line heard noise. The ancient world knew this problem intimately, which is why the Spartans marched into contact to the sound of pipers playing the aulos, not for morale but for cadence, a rhythm that could be felt when words could not be heard, and it is why the late Roman writer Vigetius, compiling centuries of military practice, sorted battlefield signals into 3 formal categories: vocal commands, semi-vocal signals from trumpets and horns, and mute signals, things you see rather than hear. Rome's answer lived almost entirely in that third category, and we will get to it. But first, scale the problem up. A full legion of that era put roughly 4,500 to 5,000 men into the field. Its combat frontage could stretch hundreds of meters. A commanding general positioned behind the center of that line was, for practical purposes, on another continent. Suppose he sees the enemy's left beginning to buckle and wants his right wing to press. He tells a messenger. The messenger runs on churned ground through the rear ranks, perhaps 200 meters. Call it a minute if nothing goes wrong, and things go wrong. The runner is intercepted, the ground is littered with bodies, the officer he seeks has moved or is dead. The message is delivered to an officer who must understand it, turn, and transmit it into that wall of noise, man by man, rank by rank. By the most generous accounting, the general's decision reaches the men whose hands need to act on it 2, 3, 4 minutes after the moment he saw the opportunity, and in a melee, the opportunity he saw no longer exists. The gap in the enemy line has closed. The buckling unit has rallied or broken entirely. In close combat, the tactical situation reshuffles itself on a timescale of seconds, and the voice and runner network operates on a timescale of minutes. That mismatch is not an inconvenience. Along a shield wall, a lag of that size is a death sentence, because the side that reacts in seconds dismantles the side that reacts in minutes. Rome could not make sound travel faster. Sound moves at 343 meters per second whether a consul wishes it or not, and battlefield noise swallows it regardless. So Rome did the only thing left. It stopped trying to move orders to the decision and moved the decision to the front. Crastinus was not standing at Pharsalus in the killing corner as a gesture. He was standing there because that corner was where the information was. Now the mechanism, piece by piece, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The Roman answer had 2 halves, an organizational half and a perceptual half. The organizational half was the manipular system, the famous checkerboard. Instead of one continuous phalanx, the Legion of the Middle Republic deployed in 3 lines of small independent blocks, maniples, arranged in a quincunx pattern with gaps between them, the triplex aces hastati in front, principes behind them, and the veteran triarii in reserve. So scarce and so decisive that when a Roman said matters had come to the triorii, it was a proverb meaning things were desperate. Roman tradition, preserved in Livy, connects the birth of this system to the Samnite Wars of the 4th century BTE. Decades of fighting in the broken hill country of central Italy where a rigid phalanx tore itself apart on the terrain and small articulated blocks did not. A 2010 historical study tracing the earliest constitution of the Manipular Legion follows how this structure was assembled, and a 2015 archaeology paper examining Greco-Macedonian influences on the Manipular system makes the point that Rome was not inventing in a vacuum. It was reorganizing ideas already circulating in the Mediterranean world into something with a different center of gravity, and the different center of gravity is the whole point. A phalanx has 1 brain. A manipular legion had dozens. Every century carried its own centurion, and every centurion carried standing authority to act on what was in front of him, hold, give ground, wheel, exploit, without waiting for anyone. Listen to the job description that Polybius, a Greek officer who watched this machine work from the inside in the 2nd century BCE, wrote down. Romans wanted centurions, he says, who were not so much bold and adventurous as steady, men who would hold their ground when hard pressed and die at their posts. That is not a description of a hero. It is a specification for a component, a reliable node that keeps functioning under load, and Rome paid for that reliability accordingly, a senior centurion drawing many multiples of a common soldier's wage, with the first spear rank at the top of a ladder that a soldier like Spurius Ligust, whose career livy records, could spend 22 years climbing campaign by campaign. Rome had replaced a single slow decision loop with 30 fast local ones, each run by a selected, tested, expensively retained professional. But distributed command only works if each local commander can actually transmit his decision to his 80 men faster than the voice network allows. Which brings us to the perceptual half and the crest. A centurion's helmet crest ran transversely ear to ear, a sideways bar of color riding above the entire formation, and you can examine the general form of these helmets in museum collections today, including Roman examples catalogued in the British Museum. Ask yourself why sideways. A soldier in a shield wall cannot look at his officer. His eyes are locked forward, on the man trying to kill him, and taking them off that man for even a moment is how he dies. Whatever signal the centurion sends has to arrive through the edge of the soldier's vision, through the periphery, while the center of his gaze stays on the enemy, and peripheral vision is a strange instrument. It is poor at detail, poor at reading, poor at recognizing faces, because the cone cells that resolve fine detail and color are packed into the fovea, a region covering only a couple of degrees at the center of gaze. But the retina also carries on the order of 120 million rod cells, spread across the periphery, feeding fast pathways in the visual system that are tuned for one thing above all others, detecting motion and change. The edge of your eye is a tripwire, not a camera, and the tripwire is fast. A 1982 study in the journal Vision Research measured exactly this: how people react to motion presented at the edges of the visual field and how fast that motion appears to them, and the underlying fact it depends on is the one the Romans were exploiting. The eye does not need to be aimed at a thing to register that the thing is moving. Now run the geometry. A crest mounted front to back when its wearer steps forward presents almost no change in profile to the men beside him, a thin edge moving along its own axis, a few centimeters of visual change at most. A transverse crest is different. Seen from the side from where his own men stand, it is a wide horizontal bar, 30 centimeters or more of stiffened, often brightly colored horsehair held above the helmet line of every other man on the field, and when the centurion strides forward or turns or drops back, that bar sweeps through their peripheral vision as a large, high-contrast moving shape. The centurion's body was the signal, the crest was the antenna. When he advanced, 80 men registered the motion at the edge of their eyes and advanced with him. No words required, no messenger, no minutes of lag. The transmission time of the order was the transmission time of light plus a human reaction, a fraction of a second, delivered simultaneously to every man with line of sight. Rome had built, in horsehair and bronze, a broadcast system that battlefield noise could not jam. And there is a second experiment that explains something else: the Roman obsession with formation discipline, with keeping the line dressed and the body steady. A 1974 experiment in the Journal of Experimental Psychology found that when a person's body is being rotated, accelerated through a turn, their reaction time to motion in peripheral vision gets measurably worse. The vestibular system's signal of self-motion interfering with the interpretation of motion out at the edge of the eye. The channel degrades exactly when the body is whirling. Think about what that means for a melee. The soldier who spins, who flails, who fights as an individual duelist turning to every threat, is not just exposing his flank, he is degrading the very sensory channel the whole command system runs on. The legionary who holds his position, feet planted, facing front, working the short thrusting gladius from behind a stable shield rather than swinging wide, is keeping his peripheral receiver stable and pointed at his officer. Roman drill, all those months of marching in dressing ranks that ancient writers describe with something like religious awe, was not ceremony. Vegetius Records recruits drilled morning and afternoon, marched 20 Roman miles in 5 hours in full kit, made to practice against posts with weighted wooden swords, and Josephus who fought against the legions in Judea and then watched them from inside their camps, wrote the famous summary that their drills were bloodless battles and their battles bloody drills. It was, among other things, maintenance of the network. Watch the system run in 3 battles, because each one shows a different face of the same equation. First, Cynoscephalae, 197 BCE, a ridgeline in Thessaly. Fog in the morning, a Roman army under Titus Quinctius Flamininus colliding almost by accident with the Macedonian phalanx of Philip V, roughly 25,000 men on each side, a fair test. The battle split across the ridge. On one flank the phalanx, downhill pikes leveled, 16 ranks deep with the sarissa reaching over 6 meters, was grinding the Romans backward, and on the other flank the Romans, led by their elephants, were winning against Macedonian units that had not yet even formed up out of marching order. And then came one of the most consequential small decisions in ancient military history. A junior Roman officer, so junior the sources never even preserve his name, saw it, took 20 maniples out of the victorious wing on his own initiative and turned them onto the rear of the winning phalanx. No order from Flamininus, no time for one. The phalanx, magnificent from the front and helpless from behind, because a 16-rank pike block cannot turn around in contact, came apart, and Macedon's power was broken in an afternoon. Around 8,000 Macedonians killed and 5,000 captured against roughly 700 Romans dead. 20 maniples means 20 formed units executing a wheel and an attack on the word of a man far below supreme command, and the system was built so that they could. Polybius, analyzing exactly this battle, spelled out the verdict: the phalanx has one time and one type of ground on which it is supreme, and the legion can fight anywhere, in parts or as a whole, because its parts can act alone. That is the manipular equation paying out. Decision latency measured in seconds against an enemy whose decisions had to route through a king. Second, Pydna, 168 BCE. The counter case, the same matchup run again with the terrain as the variable. The battle ignited almost by accident. A skirmish over a runaway pack animal near a stream escalating in the afternoon heat, and on the flat coastal plain, the phalanx of Perseus advanced in full order. Plutarch records that the Roman commander, Aemilius Paulus, a veteran of decades of war, admitted afterward that the sight of that advancing pike wall filled him with astonishment and terror, and the first Romans to meet it died, proving why. An allied officer named Salvius, hurling his unit standard into the enemy mass to force his men to attack, and the pikes taking them anyway, spitting men through shields. The wall was close to unstoppable while it stayed continuous. But the ground was not flat for long, and as the phalanx pushed forward over broken terrain, small gaps opened between its blocks, gaps that a centrally commanded formation could neither see in time nor close in time. Because the men in the gap had no local authority to fix it, and the king's decision loop ran in minutes. Paulus did not need to invent a response. And this is the crucial detail. The sources describe the Roman line dissolving into small units and inserting themselves into the seams, which is to say the maniples did what their standing instruction already told them to do. Exploiting gaps was delegated in advance. Century by century, on local initiative, Romans turned into the seams with swords against pikemen holding 6-meter shafts who could not face sideways, and the phalanx was butchered from inside its own formation. The ancient figures claiming on the order of 20,000 Macedonian dead in about an hour against Roman losses, so like the sources put them near 100. Pydna is what it looks like when a fast decision network meets a slow one at close range. Third, the failure because a mechanism is only proven when you find the conditions that break it. The Teutoburg forest, 9 cc con e. 3 full legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, plus auxiliaries and a train of camp followers. Perhaps 20,000 people in all, under Publius Quinctilius Varus, a governor whose experience was tax and law in settled provinces, strung out in a marching column miles long. In dense woodland, in driving rain, ambushed by Germanic warriors under Arminius, a Coruscan noble who held Roman citizenship and equestrian rank, had commanded Roman auxiliaries, and knew the machine from the inside. Consider what that terrain does to everything we have described. The visual broadcast system needs line of sight, and the forest reduces line of sight to a few meters. Rain-soaked shields grow heavy, and the transverse crest is a signal only to men who can see it. The maniple is a fast decision node only when it can form, and its men can hold a front and keep their officer at the edge of their vision. In the trees, in a column under attack from the flanks, none of that existed, and the archaeology confirms the mechanism of the killing, because since amateur archaeologist Tony Clun began pulling Roman coins and sling bullets out of a field at Calcarees in 1987, excavation has revealed a prepared turf rampart built along the Roman line of march, a wall Arminius constructed in advance, so that his men could strike the strung-out column from cover and withdraw before any formation could respond. Each centurion's command radius, hundreds of square meters of instantly coordinated men in open field, collapsed to the handful of soldiers within arm's reach. The legions were not outfought man for man, so much as disassembled into thousands of individuals, and over 3 days of running ambush they were annihilated almost to the last cohort, Varus falling on his own sword. Suetonius says, Augustus took the news so hard he beat his head against a door, crying out for Varus to give him back his legions. And the empire meant it, because the numbers 17, 18, and 19 were never assigned to a Roman legion again. Arminius, knowingly or not, had done the one thing the mathematics demanded. He never attacked the network where it functioned. He chose ground where the network could not exist. So lay the design out as its makers might have, 5 deliberate engineering decisions, each one an answer to the same equation. Decision 1, position. The centurion stood in the front rank, at the right of his unit, traditionally the exposed side, the side away from the shield. That placement bought 2 things at once. It put the officer's eyes at the point of contact, so his information was 0 seconds old. No runner, no report, no summary, the raw battle itself, and it put his body where every man in the unit could key on it. The price was exactly what you would expect, and it repeats across Caesar's own writing like a drumbeat. At the Sabis River in 57 BTE, with the 12th legion nearly overrun by the Nervii, Caesar records that every centurion of the 4th cohort had been killed. At Gergovia, he counts 46 centurions lost in a single failed assault. And at Pharsalus, 30 centurions dead against some 200 men, is that price recorded in ink, along with the words Caesar says. Crastinus spoke to him before the charge, that whether he lived or died that day, the general would owe him thanks. Roan ran the numbers and paid, because one officer making correct decisions 3 minutes faster was worth more than the officer. Decision 2, the transverse crest, the sideways antenna, a signal engineered for the physiology of peripheral motion detection centuries before anyone could have described that physiology, discovered the way most pre-scientific engineering is discovered. By keeping what worked and burying what did not, 10,000 engagements acting as the selection pressure. Decision 3, delegation in advance. The manipular system did not merely permit local initiative, it presupposed it. The standing doctrines exploit the gap, refuse the flank, relieve the forward line through the intervals so that fresh hastati could rotate out and princeps rotate in without the line ever opening, were loaded into every centurion before the battle, so that in the moment, no permission had to travel anywhere. The order had, in effect, been given weeks earlier on the drill field, and modern militaries have a name for exactly this, commander's intent. The Prussian Auftrags tactic that Moltke built the German general staff around, tell the subordinate what outcome is needed and let him decide how. Because he can see what you cannot. The centurion had it 2,000 years earlier. Decision 4, redundancy. Every century carried a second officer, the optio, a name that literally means the chosen man, picked by the centurion himself, and his post was the rear rank, the opposite corner of the formation from his centurion, where he carried a long staff, the hastel, for physically pushing wavering men back into place. Read that as an engineer. The unit had 2 nodes at maximum separation, one at the point of contact, one watching the whole block from behind, closing stragglers up and holding the rear rank steady, and if the front node went down and the casualty rate say it often did, a man failed over to the rear node and the unit kept functioning. There was even a third man, the tesserarius, keeper of the watchword, a shallow further layer of the same hierarchy. Crastinus dies at Pharsalus, and his century does not dissolve, because the system never depended on his survival, only on his position, and Caesar, who understood exactly what he had lost, singled Crastinus out by name in his own account and buried him with honors. Decision 5, layered channels. The visual broadcast of the crest was the fast channel, but it ran alongside others, the signum, the standard raised above each maniple as a rallying reference visible over the dust, the aquila of the whole legion behind it, and the horns, the cornu curling around the player's body, carrying a small vocabulary of gross signals, advance, recall, that could cut through noise when nuance was not required, precisely Vegetius's semi-vocal and mute categories running in parallel. Fast local channel for maneuver, slow loud channel for army, wide intent, a division any modern communications engineer would recognize instantly. And that word, modern, is not decoration, because in the middle of the 20th century, the same equation was solved again from scratch. John Boyd was an American fighter pilot, later one of the Pentagon's most influential and most difficult strategic minds, a man so confident in fast transitions that at the Air Force Fighter Weapons School, he carried a standing bet, starting from a position of disadvantage. He would reverse any challenger onto his tail within 40 seconds or pay $40, and by every account he never paid. The puzzle that started him was Korea. On paper, the Soviet MiG-15 matched or beat the American FD-6 Sabre, climbing faster and turning tighter in parts of the envelope, yet the Sabre pilots won at a lopsided ratio, and Boyd's answer was not in the performance charts. The Sabre had a bubble canopy, so its pilot saw more, observed faster, and it had fully hydraulic controls, so it transitioned between maneuvers faster, and the fight was decided not by who had the better single maneuver, but by who could cycle through observation, orientation, decision, and action quicker, each cycle putting the slower pilot further behind events until his responses answered a fight that no longer existed. Out of that analysis, and the energy maneuverability theory he built after it, came the framework now taught in war colleges everywhere, the OODA loop. Boyd's claim was radical in its simplicity. Combat between organizations is a race between decision cycles, and the side that gets through its loop faster does not just gain an edge, it makes the slower side's decisions irrelevant. That is Pydna in 4 words. That is the phalanx's king watching gaps open faster than his orders could close them. And Boyd's fingerprints are on the modern world, on the lightweight agile design of the F-16, on the United States Marine Corps Doctrine Manual Warfighting, published in 1989, which formally rebuilt an entire service around maneuver, tempo, and decentralized decision-making. Junior leaders acting on commander's intent, which is to say, around centurions. The centurion in the front rank was a compression of Boyd's entire loop into a single body standing at the point of contact, observation, orientation, decision, and action, separated by nothing but his own reaction time. And the problem has not aged. A 2024 paper in the International Journal for Multidisciplinary Research revisits Boyd's OODA framework for the era of artificial intelligence, assisted military decision-making, asking how machines might shorten the loop further. And the striking thing about that literature is that the question being asked is the Roman question, unchanged after 2,000 years. Where must the decision physically sit, relative to the information, for the loop to outrun the enemies? Rome's answer was a man on a sideways crest, standing where the swords were. If you take one idea from this episode, take the reframing. The image of the centurion as simply the bravest man, leading from the front because Romans admired courage, is not wrong, but it is the smallest part of the truth. The front rank position was a calculated placement of the decision-maker at the point of minimum information lag. The transverse crest was a motion signal built for the periphery of the human eye. The optio at the rear was engineered redundancy. And the checkerboard was 30 fast decision loops arrayed against enemies who had one slow one. Cynoscephalae, Pydna, and the price paid at Pharsalus were that arithmetic playing out on grass and stone, and the Teutoburg forest was the proof by failure, the day the terrain unplugged the network and 3 legions ceased to exist. Rome did not always have the better soldiers. For long stretches, it demonstrably did not. What it had at its best was the shorter loop, and it bought that loop with the lives of men like Crastinus, one officer at a time, standing in the corner of the formation where the mathematics said the decision had to live. If this changed the way you look at a battle line, subscribe to the War Room Files and tap the like button, because it genuinely decides whether episodes like this one reach the next person who thinks a crest is just decoration. I will see you on the next field.